Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie. And in this video, I'm going to be looking at the weekend of April the 19th and 20th, 2025. So Sunday is April the 20th, and that is the 136th birthday, or at least it would be the 136th birthday of Adolf Hitler. And in this video, I want to consider the horoscopes of dictators and people who are perhaps accused of being dictators, and that leads from my video from Friday where I looked at Mars in Leo, and I think there was a certain tendency for people with Mars in Leo, at least politicians with Mars in Leo, to be accused of dictatorial tendencies. So in a way, this is a development. Now, what is it? What is it? And that makes a dictator a dictator. Now, on the thumbnail of this video, I have a picture of Charlie Chaplin in his film The Great Dictator, which was came out in 1940. And Charlie Chaplin was born on April the 16th, 1889. In other words, he was born 4 days before Hitler. So Charlie Chaplin was an Aries. Hitler was a Taurus. So there are some similarities, many similarities between Hitler and Charlie Chaplin's horoscopes, but one big difference they had was one of sun sign. And I do want to do a comparison of Hitler and Charlie Chaplin's charts. I don't know how much I'll be able to cover. There are a few dictators I want to look at in this video. I might run out of time, but we'll see how it goes. But before I do all that, I want to consider the astrology and I Ching for this weekend, and it's of course the Easter weekend, so happy Easter. And if you happen to enjoy this video, feel free to like it, and if you're not subscribed, feel free to become a subscriber. So here is the chart for the weekend. Actually, this is a chart for Charlie Chaplin. I'll be looking at that in a moment. So, sorry, later in the video, not in a moment. Here's the chart for the weekend. And this is midnight on April the 20th, 2025, which is a Sunday. So it's the very beginning of Sunday. So the weekend starts with the moon, in the middle of the weekend, the moon is at 19 Capricorn. So really it is a Capricorn weekend. If you are in the United States, or if you're in the Americas, then on Sunday afternoon, late afternoon, maybe Sunday evening, depending on your time zone, probably Sunday evening for most of you, the moon does move into Aquarius. But I think looking at things from a global perspective, we can say that it is a moon in Capricorn weekend. And so the usual stuff about moon in Capricorn. Moon is in an earth sign, and for a time, the moon was the only personal planet in an earth sign, but on Saturday at 20:56 p.m., well, that's at 8:56 p.m. London time, the sun goes into Taurus, and so by midnight on Sunday, there it is, sun at 0 degrees 20 Taurus, and so that is an important event. It represents lasting earthiness. So over the last few months, there's not been much earth around except for Uranus in Taurus, and there may have been a certain lack of groundedness in people's behavior. And so what's happening now is we've got the sun in Taurus, and it stays in Taurus obviously for a month, and meanwhile, other planets are going to slowly start to move towards Taurus. By May. I mean, when does Mercury move into Taurus? Mercury moves into Taurus in next month. So So Mercury moves into Taurus May the 11th. So really, the Taurus season is starting. So yeah, I do regard that as a major change. Now, the Sun, when it moves into Taurus, it actually makes a square to Mars. Now, that square to Mars, I don't think is exact over the weekend, but it's something we're going to feel over the weekend. I'm actually personally, I'm a little bit worried about that Mars in Taurus, about the Sun at 0 degrees 20 Taurus, because it makes a square to Mars. Now, the reason I'm worried about it is because of my own chart. Hold on, let me just show you why I'm worried. Let me just show you the reason I'm worried. If you look at my chart, so if something happens to me, you'll know what happened. So here it is. It's very simple. Here's my horoscope. You'll see that I have got Mars at 0 degrees 50 Taurus, and so that means that the Sun is the Sun is going to be conjunct my Mars at the same time as Mars is going to be square my Mars. So that does make me accident prone. Maybe bad things are going to happen, perhaps. Maybe I just have to be careful. That's all. And I do have to watch what I'm doing. But yeah, if I don't come up with another video, if this is my last video, well, you'll know what happened. At least there'll be a logical explanation. Sorry to talk about myself, but I just thought I would throw that in. So the Mars, when it moves Mars is actually in Leo now, very early Leo, and so we've got this Sun Mars square coming up, and also Mars early Leo, it's making a trine to Neptune. So that is a feature of the weekend. You could say it's perhaps the main feature of the weekend. Mars is what we put our energy into, and so Mars trine Neptune, it might be that some of us want to put our energy into Neptunian pursuits. That might be art, it could be spirituality. Of course, it is the Easter weekend when some of us are thinking, about the central myth of Christianity. I'm not going to pass judgment on it, but the concept of birth and death and resurrection, it's very much with us. And so with Mars trine Neptune, if we sort of tune into Easter and the meaning of Easter, then we might feel somewhat uplifted by it all with Mars trine Neptune. But it doesn't have to be about religion. Mars trine Neptune can be about art, creativity, exploring our ideas and our fantasies, and that's great, provided we don't take things too far. And then as we move into Sunday, the moon does start making a few aspects, because a lot of the aspects that the moon makes are late in the sign. So the moon makes a sextile to Venus, it makes a trine to Uranus, sextile to Saturn, sextile to Uranus. So there are quite a lot of lunar aspects on Sunday, and that might mean that actually Saturday has a lot of promise, but the real activity might actually be on Sunday. And on Sunday we have a sextile between Venus and Uranus. We had a Venus-Uranus sextile quite recently, but then Venus went retrograde. But now it's coming back, and there is Venus sextile Uranus. Still, Venus is very close to the conjunction of the Sun. So Venus sextile Uranus is a fun aspect. It can be. It's about things happening that we hadn't necessarily expected, and also being pleasantly surprised by other people. Venus sextile Uranus can be an aspect that is connected to relationships and things happening in relationships that we hadn't really planned for, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they are bad. They might be pleasantly surprising. And so that's the picture for New York for midnight on Sunday. Slightly different picture if it's Sydney, Australia. I mean, the moon is at midnight on Sunday. It's just going to be earlier in the sign, and if you are in Sydney, Australia, or in Australasia in general, there's no way the moon is going to be in Aquarius. Moon will move into be in Aquarius on Monday. And then there is the heliocentric picture, very quickly. So the Earth is always exactly opposite the Sun. So in the heliocentric view, the Earth has gone into Scorpio. And so we start to pick up on an aspect that we can see in the geocentric chart as well, because geocentrically, when the Sun moves into Taurus, it starts making a square to Pluto in Aquarius. Heliocentrically, it's kind of the same thing. As the Earth moves into Scorpio, it starts making a square to, again, Pluto in Aquarius. So maybe we're starting to feel that, with the Sun in Taurus, or indeed in this case, Earth in Scorpio. It is a fixed sign. Things are getting more intense. People are taking things more seriously, and Earth square Pluto. Things are getting. They're getting more serious, and people are being maybe more stubborn. I mean, that is something one would expect with the Sun moving into Taurus. So, in this case, the heliocentric chart is just reflecting what we already know from the heliocentric chart is just reflecting what we already know from the geocentric chart. And Mercury is doing things. In fact, we can kind of say that we've got a T-square here, because Mercury is at 24 Sagittarius, heliocentrically. It's making a square to Saturn, and it's making an opposition to Jupiter. So the Jupiter-Saturn square is being reactivated by Mercury, and I do regard the Jupiter-Saturn square as saying a great deal about economics and the business cycle. And so with Mercury aspecting both Jupiter and Saturn, it might be an Easter weekend, but that doesn't mean to say nothing is happening with the news, economic news, financial news. So we might hear things and we might worry about things, because that's Mercury, and perhaps that's what people are going to be talking about. And on a more personal level, well, Mercury is square Saturn. And so with Mercury square Saturn, there could be a feeling of pessimism over the weekend. And that pessimism is probably going to be more about the economy than our own lives. And we're trying to make sense of it all. And, Mercury squares Saturn, then it makes an opposition to Jupiter. So Mercury opposition Jupiter might be about trying to make the best of things, but then Mercury opposition Jupiter could be an exaggerated response. So when you hear bad news, especially bad news relating to the world and the world economy, don't necessarily take it to heart, and don't do anything too drastic, because there's probably nothing you can do about it, first point to make. And secondly, it may in the end not be quite as bad as it looks. And as you know, if you've been looking at my videos, I'm not entirely convinced that the world is in a state of total and permanent economic collapse. I think that this just feels wrong with the Jupiter-Saturn cycle where it is. It's a first quarter aspect between Jupiter and Saturn, and in the past one has actually sort of managed to get over it. And I do think in the early summer, when Jupiter starts to move into Cancer, there will be an improvement. But I've said that already, and I'll certainly be saying it again. So let me now look at the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for the weekend of April the 19th and 20th, 2025. Aries. Aries, it's an Easter weekend, perhaps, if you celebrate Easter, and it's often a time where no one wants to do anything of any material value, perhaps. But Aries, you are quite ambitious with the moon moving through Capricorn, all weekend long. And you don't want to just do nothing. And you want to get going on things. And as far as material ambitions are concerned, if they are important to you, if you have a job or a business, then you're not going to want to stand by and do nothing. And you're going to be thinking about, what is your next step? What could your next step be? And if you can't actually do anything concrete, you can at least think about it, and you can be planning. And you could say that Moon in Capricorn, does make a nice balance to the Aries energy. Aries is dynamic, wants to just take action, doesn't want to think about things too much. Moon in Capricorn is a more practical and perhaps selfish energy, which at times you actually need. I mean, Aries can actually be very selfish. There is a characterization of Aries where selfishness is central to it. But this is selfish in a more materialistic way, maybe, and perhaps it's about you looking after your own material needs. And right now, with the Moon in Capricorn, there's nothing to be ashamed of, and it's therefore a good opportunity to fine-tune your strategy, to think about what is important to you, and also to remember that the sun is no longer in Aries. This weekend, the sun moves out of Aries. And so with the sun moving out of Aries and into Taurus, there might be a change. I mean, there will be a change. And short term, you might feel a certain loss of power, as if something has gone temporarily. And I actually think that the sun in Taurus could be a benefit, because with the sun in Taurus, your emphasis is changing. When the sun is in Aries, you're thinking about you taking the initiative, you doing things, you making things happen, and you having ideas, you being the leader. With sun in Taurus, the question is a question of how do you actually go and do it? What are the practical steps you need to take? And with the sun in Taurus and the moon in Capricorn, I think that practicality may be quite a major feature of your life, and not just over the weekend. As you move into the Taurus season, as the sun progresses through this sign, it is an earth sign, you will start to understand that the financial element really is important. And the sun is making a square to Mars, and this is something that I did talk about in the introduction to this video. The sun in Taurus is it's starting to make a square to Mars. I think that Sun-Mars square is exact on Monday, rather than over the weekend. I mean, to be precise, that Sun-Mars square is exact at 2:34 on Monday morning, London time. So that Sun-Mars square is actually a feature of late on Sunday. So late on Sunday, if you are in the Americas. So if you're in the Americas, you get that Sun-Mars square late on Sunday. I think it's exact late on Sunday. You're still going to get it to an extent if you're in Europe or Africa. So in fact, Sunday evening may be the time where it hits home, unless you're in Asia or Australia or New Zealand, when that could be a feature of Monday. So that Sun square Mars potentially is dangerous, because you've got these two really dynamic planets making a square to each other, and it could make you accident prone, and that's one way of looking at it. It could lead to an argument. You and someone else may disagree with one another, and it isn't helped by the fact that Pluto is involved. So you've got the Sun making a square to Pluto, you've got Mars making an opposition to Pluto. So Aries, at the end of a weekend, you just may find that the pressure starts to increase. And Aries is quite capable of getting angry, and so do consider the provocations, and that that is something really, it could spoil the weekend. But is it necessary? I don't think it is necessary. Just keep your cool and avoid people who in the past you had major disagreements with. So Aries, you can see that it could actually be a very dynamic weekend. It's not a weekend for doing nothing, and you have to decide what is important to you, and at the same time try to be understanding of other people's weaknesses, because if you've got the potential of a disagreement forming with Sun square Mars, you have to ask, what does that say about the other person, the person who you might have a disagreement with? And again, we've got Venus making a conjunction to Saturn. We've also got Venus making a sextile to Uranus. So Venus conjunct Saturn and Venus sextile Uranus could be about another person feeling pressurized, but then having no choice but to act. And so don't assume that people who are meek and mild are just going to stay that way. They might hit a point where they just have to say something, have to do something. So do be aware of that. So but it's quite a complicated weekend, a lot going on, and I've forgot to talk about Mars trine Neptune. And Mars trine Neptune is probably the weekend at the highest level. Mars is you, it's trine Neptune. It's a very spiritual aspect, and it is an Easter weekend. So even if you're not a Christian, even if you don't believe in anything, Mars trine Neptune is asking you to look at things at another level at the same time as Moon is in Capricorn. So however focused you are on yourself and your own selfish needs, you need to try to think about something else. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with being selfish, but you do have to understand with Mars trine Neptune that there is something higher than yourself, and now might be a good opportunity to start tuning into it. And all this emphasizes the point, Aries, that it is a complicated weekend where there is a lot going on, and a lot of it is contradictory. So just pack as much as you can in, and don't do anything too dangerous because of that Sun square Mars. Taurus, the Sun is moving into your sign. The Taurus season is arriving, and I do think that this is a big relief, because one of the problems of being a Taurus over the last few months has been that there just hasn't been much Earth in the sky, or unless you count Uranus, but Uranus has been in Taurus for best part of 6 years. I can't remember exactly what year it went into Taurus, but it's been there a long time. And there have been periods aside from Uranus this year where there's just been no Earth in the sky. And so with the Sun in Taurus, you've got the Sun in Taurus for the next month, and on May the 11th, I think around May the 11th, Mercury moves into Taurus. So the Taurus season is starting, and you're going to just feel just more at home, and you're going to feel that, you're in your element, and you're going to be able to start to make sense of things, which in the past might have been quite difficult. And when you've got when you've got the sun moving into Taurus, this gives you a new sense of self, and you want to look after yourself and you want to look after your own interests, and that's great. But there is a Sun square Mars forming, and Sun square Mars, it could be quite an aggressive aspect. Now, this aspect is exact Sunday evening, Monday morning, so it starts to have an influence by the end of the weekend. And the Sun square Mars aspect could actually be quite aggravating, and you're going to be very keen to defend your own interests. Mars has already gone into Leo, and with Mars in Leo, you are thinking about what is important to you in a material sense, and it could relate to your home and your family and whatever security means to you. And so with Sun square Mars, you might feel that you have to defend your position over the weekend, and that kind of depends what's happening over the weekend. So if there's a lot going on over the weekend, if there are a lot of people around you, if maybe there are people in your own home, or there's pressure for you to do this and that, and go to celebrations or meetings or parties, to begin with, you might just want to give in to this pressure. But I think you have to understand your own defensiveness over the weekend, because at some stage that defensiveness will cut in, and you're going to want to tell people how you feel, and you're going to probably do it in no uncertain terms. And well, if you can't communicate, I think you will be able to communicate, but if you can't communicate, well, you're just going to get angry. And so Taurus, probably when you're looking at the weekend, you need to put yourself in a position where you have as much freedom as possible, where people are not in your way. Because if people are in your way, it could become a very difficult weekend. On the other hand, if no one is in your way, if you have complete freedom, then the malefic influence of that Sun square Mars may never manifest. And we may be talking about the moon in Capricorn, in a really quite spiritual sector of your chart, and that might allow you to tune into the spirituality of the weekend. This weekend is about life and renewed life, and the moon is making a sextile to Venus, and it's making a sextile to Saturn on Sunday. And so with those aspects, you might start to realize something, something that you thought was sort of quite vague, spiritual but vague. It might have some concrete manifestation, and you might get a new sense of self and a new sense of meaning. And meaning is not vague and pie in the sky. It is actually very concrete. And so some Taurians may actually get a strong sense of sort of underlying purpose, and you might just realize what you need to do. And that is happening at the same time as the sun is moving into your sign. And so it could be a very concrete Easter, when you get a real idea about what you are supposed to be doing, what you feel you should be doing, and at the same time you can also be a unique individual, because Venus is not just making a conjunction to Saturn, it's making a sextile to Uranus. So Venus sextile Uranus is about you doing something which is different, and not just different for the sake of it. Uranus has been in your sign for, as I've just said, the best part of 7 years or 6 years, because I can't remember exactly when it went into Taurus. And now Venus is making that sextile. So perhaps you get an insight into what your unique destiny is, what makes you special, what is the unique expression of your individuality. And with Venus trine Uranus, it can actually be very clear to you, especially as Venus is conjunct Saturn as well. So Saturn is stabilizing things. It's making it clear. So the thing that makes you unique, Taurus, can now be obvious. And it may just then be that this whole process of Uranus moving through Taurus over the last few years is starting to culminate. It's starting to make sense. Gemini. Gemini, it's a weekend where you might still feel that you're finding your feet. You're not absolutely sure what is happening, and you might be a little distracted. And while it is a busy weekend, when you look at what's happening around you, I'm just not convinced you're going to want to be part of it. I mean, why should you want to be part of it? You've got the moon still moving through Capricorn, and so with the moon moving through Capricorn, you're feeling at times a little bit uneasy because you can't entirely relate to what's going on around you, and you may be thinking more than expected about it. Now, you could say it's overthinking, but there's nothing wrong with thinking too much. Well, there's always something wrong with thinking too much, but thinking a lot about something and thinking about something's implications, sometimes that just has to be done. And that might, Gemini, be the frame of mind that you're currently in. Everything has a consequence as far as you're concerned, and you're trying to work it out, and you don't want to stick your neck out. Now, Gemini has a reputation for being experimental, wanting to do anything to pique their curiosity, but I don't think you're particularly curious this weekend, certainly by Gemini standards. Now, the moon in Capricorn does make a sextile with Venus and Saturn, and indeed the North Node. So, by the end of the weekend, by Sunday, of course, if you're in Europe, I think the weekend keeps going. It will keep. Monday is it's a bank holiday, isn't it, in England? So that will keep going, because if you're in America, well, it's just Saturday and Sunday, isn't it? So the moon making a sextile to Venus and Saturn, you start to get a few insights into what you would like to be doing and what could be useful for you, because this Venus conjunct Saturn in Pisces does relate to some of your ambitions and some of the things you feel you would like to be doing. And so when you have those insights, do start to think about how you can act on those insights, and that's a good thing to be doing. Though, Gemini, it's going to be quite difficult to think about the present. We're supposed to think about the present, isn't it? I mean, that's where we're supposed to be most happy. Treat every breath as being your last. That's what a Buddhist monk once told me. That's what Buddhists kind of believe, isn't it? Live in the present. I mean, everyone says you're supposed to believe in the present, but it's going to be very difficult to exist in the present. I mean, me as a Gemini, I find it impossible to live in the present. I'm regretting the past or pondering the future, but the present always gets trashed. And I'm afraid there's a danger that this weekend the present does get trashed, because you're thinking about other things, and you're thinking about what's going to happen after Easter, after when the weekend is done. What do you need to accomplish? But maybe that's okay. I mean, you've got things to work through, and if possible, if you really can, Gemini, if you can try to find some human company. You need a I think you do need a distraction this weekend, and you don't have to spend all your time with other people, and you don't want to be with people who are too heavy or too serious. But having a diversion, yeah, especially on Sunday, would just make things easier and would make you feel, more relaxed. And that's perhaps what you need, just maybe a couple of hours. But it will be a weekend where you're not entirely present because you're thinking about something else. And also the sun is moving into Taurus. So with the sun moving into Taurus, you know that the sun is about to go into Gemini in a month's time, but it's not there yet. And sometimes with the sun in Taurus, it can be a time of preparation where you are thinking about the future. You're not thinking about the present, and you're just perhaps thinking that you should just do whatever you need to do, but not be in the center of things. And that might be how you respond to that sun change, to that sign change by the sun. So again, it's another day, or at least another weekend, where I'm perhaps not as positive as you'd like me to be. Remember, I'm a Gemini. I'm talking to myself as well, but don't worry about it too much. And if you can work some things out, and I think you can work some things out and work out what needs to be done as far as future advances and progress is concerned, then I think that you can have some important realizations. But in general, try not to have too many expectations for this weekend. But if you can somehow find a way of enjoying yourself, even if it's only for a few minutes, that would be a bonus. Cancer, for the whole weekend, the moon is in Capricorn, in your opposite sign, and so with the moon moving through Capricorn, it might be the case that you have to spend a certain amount of time thinking about other people and what other people want and what their demands are. And that could be a slight irritation, but I don't think that you have to exaggerate. So you don't have to go out of your way to help anyone out or be of service to another person. Small gestures are enough. And that could be a problem, that for some reason you might decide you want to punish yourself or to demonstrate that you are a bit of a martyr, by going above and beyond the call of duty. And it's not necessary. You need to do what is necessary and no more, and don't forget your own interests. And so that is probably the best way of managing the moon in Capricorn. And the moon, while it's in Capricorn, it makes some good aspects. It makes a sextile to Venus. It makes a sextile to Saturn. And that sextile with the Venus-Saturn conjunction, I think, could be quite helpful with relationships. So relationships are not about you going out of your way to help another person. There is a mutuality to it, and so the right people can be of great benefit to you, and you can really be enriched by another person's company. And that probably means that you have to make some choices. It is Easter weekend. There could be different possibilities of a social nature, and you don't have to give in to all these possibilities. You have to decide, which possibility is best for you. And so, you're a Cancerian. You know other people's track records. So if you choose the right company, then I think that you should be fine. Now, one event that we do have is the sun moving out of Aries and into Taurus. Of course, this does happen every year. Around April 19th, April 20th, Sun moves into Taurus. And so with the Sun moving into Taurus, it can be a time of year when many Cancerians are sort of more sociable than usual, because the 11th house from Cancer, which is Taurus, if you count 11 houses from, or 11 signs from Cancer, you get to Taurus. The 11th house in astrology is often connected with groups and sociability. And so it might be a time when you feel that you want to spend time with other people. But is that a good idea? Well, the problem is that the Sun is making a square to Mars. And if you spend a lot of time with people, things could happen which just irritate you. And the irritation could be of a material nature. And you might become aware that where there's social contact, there is a financial implication. It could be that you're asked for money, that you have to spend money, or that you're concerned that you're spending too much money. So social activities this weekend are fine, provided they don't have financial consequences. It shouldn't cost you anything. If it costs you money that you don't really want to spend, for example, I don't know, going to a theatre or going to a restaurant, if it's costing you money that you don't want to spend, then give it a miss, because the financial dimension cannot be ignored. And Mars is now in Leo, and with Mars in Leo, some Cancerians might be a little bit touchy about money. And again, there's nothing wrong with being touchy about money, but you ideally shouldn't put yourself in a situation where the issue of money crops up. Leo, the Sun is changing signs, and of course for a Leo that is a big deal, because the Sun is your ruler. So Sun moving into Taurus, Sun is moving into an Earth sign. This happens at around the same time every single year. So there is a seasonal aspect to it. And when the Sun moves into Taurus, it should be a time, Leo, when you are feeling quite ambitious. You want to get attention, and you want to make an impact, and you're trying to develop yourself perhaps in a public environment. So that could say a lot about your work or your career, if that is relevant. And the weekend may mark a time where you're starting to think about what you need to do, and what you'd like to do next week. And remember, the Sun is moving through Taurus for the next month, so this is just the beginning. But this time round, when the Sun moves into Taurus, it is making a square to Mars, and I think that this square Sun square Mars is actually quite an important aspect. Now, this Sun-Mars square it's exact late on Sunday and into Monday. And you can see that Mars has just entered Leo. The Sun has just entered Taurus. So with this Sun-Mars square, you actually could become extremely ambitious. Yeah. Again, it depends on who you are. But relative to yourself, I think your desire for action is going to be strong, and you're not going to want to waste time. And it may be the fact that it's a weekend, even though it's an Easter weekend, may not actually bother you too much. You don't even want to, you don't want to regard it as being a weekend, because as far as you're concerned, there are things that need to be done. And if you find that you're not able to do the things that you want to do, then you could get quite annoyed. Especially as the moon is in Capricorn as well. So moon in Capricorn, moon in an earth sign, you're thinking about all the things you want to sort out and get together, and you just haven't got time to waste. So that is a way the weekend could unfold. It doesn't have to unfold like that, and it kind of depends on your situation. But even if you're not ambitious, if you're not working, you don't have a business, if you don't want to work, you're not looking for a job, you're retired, even then we do have Sun square Mars, which is a really dynamic aspect. And so whatever your situation is, Leo, it is really a time to be projecting yourself, with, I won't say maximum force, because if I say maximum force, then that means someone could get hurt, but with as much force as you can muster without taking things too far. And yes, the Sun square Mars could be quite angry, and it might lead to some mishaps. And probably if those mishaps were to happen, it would be because you're annoyed and your anger gets expressed in a way that is not entirely helpful. And don't forget, you are a Leo, you are proud, and you don't want to be taken for granted. And if anyone does take you for granted with that Sun square Mars, they could be in trouble. Virgo, there is now some Earth around, and if you're a Virgo, that is a good thing. This year there have been times when there have been no planets in Earth signs except for Uranus in Taurus, and that could have been a little bit disconcerting. You might have felt somewhat lost, and that you didn't have anything to apply yourself to. But now the Sun is moving into Taurus, and the Sun stays in Taurus for a month, and then on May the 11th, Mercury moves into Taurus. So the Taurus season has started, and you being a Virgo, you're able to really benefit from it, and that means that you're going to feel naturally grounded, and things are going to start to make sense, and you're going to feel that you can actually apply yourself to the material world, but not in a way that is just boring. The Sun moving into Taurus, over the Easter weekend, has its own spirituality. Taurus is a sign that can indeed be extremely spiritual, can connect you to something that is larger than yourself, and so that's something that you can really tune into, and you shouldn't limit yourself. I mean, that really matters, that you don't limit yourself. I mean, you could be sort of tempted to stick to what you know and trust, but you can go a little further. You can go further, and you can perhaps see things which are beyond your normal experience. With the Sun in Taurus, and of course, its Sun in Taurus is in Taurus every single year. But this time around, the Sun is square Mars. Well, at least the Sun is square Mars over the weekend, and this Sun square Mars is going to affect everyone, but it might represent your resistance to the new. And so this could be a time where there are new experiences, new possibilities, but for some reason you dig your heels in. You find it to be a little bit of a threat, and so you might have a display of annoyance when you come across something you haven't seen before. But I would advise against that. New information, new knowledge, and in many cases new experiences should be welcomed over the weekend. So try to be as open-minded as possible, and don't be afraid of the new, because we do have planets moving into Earth sign. Because the Sun is in an Earth sign and Moon is in Capricorn, you shouldn't worry too much about losing your bearings, because fundamentally you are grounded, and because you are grounded, nothing bad is going to happen. And so it can be a weekend of sort of reanimation, where you feel that you can get back into the swing of things and you can sort of rediscover your confidence, and the material world will be there for you. Libra. Moon is moving through Capricorn. Pretty much all weekend the moon is moving through Capricorn. And because the moon is moving through Capricorn, and it is the weekend, indeed it's the Easter weekend, you might feel that you don't want to do too much, that you don't want to take too many risks, that you prefer to stick to what you know and trust. And I think that is an appropriate response. There might be pressure to do something you don't really want to do, and I would have said that in most cases you should not give in to this kind of pressure. You should stick to you should stick to what you feel is right, and not feel that you have to explore unknown territory. And when you are somewhere that you feel comfortable in, really that's when things can happen. At least things can happen of a fortunate nature. The moon in Capricorn does make a sextile to Venus. It also makes a sextile to Saturn. And I think that those two aspects are actually very grounding. And, they can remind you of what's important. And if there's anything you're trying to sort out, then that moon sextile Venus, moon sextile Saturn should really help you out there. And so it might be a weekend where you can create order out of chaos. Though we shouldn't forget that on Sunday, sort of fairly late on Sunday, Venus is making a sextile to Uranus. And that does give a slightly different emphasis to the weekend. So you've got Venus in Pisces, sextile Uranus in Taurus. So what that might mean that by the end of a weekend, you start to become aware of what makes you different, and you perhaps want to do something which is a fundamental expression of who you are. And I don't think this requires anyone else's help. It's something you do on your own, which is quite unique, and you start to realize that you are maybe the only person that can do it, and you might get a sense of your own specialness by the end of a weekend. And to begin with, it's something quite private, but perhaps next week you can start to have another look at it and see how you can perhaps be more open about what your realizations actually are. Now, in terms of relationships, I've already suggested that this is a weekend where you shouldn't feel that you have to do anything. And where there's another person, there's always a possibility of another problem, or not another problem, a problem. So people could be more trouble than they're worth, especially as the sun is making a square to Mars. And this sun square Mars, which is exact, right at the end of a weekend, is very headstrong. It's about people believing they are right and not being prepared to compromise, and perhaps even being a little bit bullying. And so you have to really look at the people you have to interact with. How could they behave? How could they behave badly? And are they going to be respectful? Now, most people are going to be respectful, but Sun square Mars just may indicate a person who could be a problem. And so from a social perspective, be wary, especially late on Sunday and into Monday. Scorpio. Scorpio, Mars has really established itself in Leo, and I talked about Mars in Leo when I did the horoscopes for Friday, and so Mars in Leo is an ambitious, perhaps even quite domineering place for Mars, and I think in many cases, Scorpio, you're going to want to be in control, and that's going to be important to you. And even though it's a weekend, as far as you're concerned, there may be things that you want to do, and you just want to get on with them. But the Sun is making a square to Mars. So this Sun square Mars, it happens because Mars has just gone into Leo, and so what's happened is that the Sun is now moving into Taurus. So Taurus is your opposite sign, and the moment the Sun moves into Taurus, it makes a square to Mars, and that is potentially a problem, and it could be a problem with other people. People may arrive on the scene who want to be taken seriously, and they want things to be done their way, and you want to do things your way. And so this means that this weekend there is the possibility of real disagreement. And so, because of course weekends is often times when the problems crop up. So Scorpio, I think you should try to think ahead and try to put yourself in a situation where these disagreements just never occur. And that might be the case that certain people should be avoided. And I haven't been saying this to you. I think it is a problem for many of the 12 signs, maybe for all of us. It is, the Sun square Mars is a generic aspect which affects everyone. But I think because Mars is your ruler, I think it could affect you very powerfully. And it could be particularly difficult if you have made a decision to do something practical over the weekend. You decide this weekend is a weekend where you want to make things happen, where you want to move forward with your ambitions. If you take that attitude, there may be resistance, and this resistance may come from a partner or a spouse, someone you know well, someone you trust, but still they don't like what you're doing, or perhaps they feel they're not getting enough attention. So in that case, maybe this is a clash that needs to be managed, that you need to be ready to compromise, but you can't compromise too much, because the sun is in Taurus, which is a fixed sign. Mars is in Taurus, which is a fixed sign. So when you've got this square, it's difficult to see how compromise can actually come about. And it's not just those two planets. Pluto is starting to get involved, because Pluto is starting to make an opposition to Mars. The Sun is starting to make a square to Pluto. And so this really could be a very dynamic aspect, and you might need a lot of patience. But you've also got to be strong. You've got to ask yourself, what is important to you. And there may be a case, Scorpio, for laying down the law in a very subtle way. Maybe some people just haven't got it. They just haven't understood something. And by explaining to another person the way things are, your interpretation of the rules, they may be your rules. And there's no harm in having your rules. I think it is actually a weekend where you can actually lay down your own code of conduct. And I think if you do it in a way which is clear, but not dictatorial, because dictatorial, I mean, of course I'm talking about dictators in this video, later in this video, but you don't want to be a dictator. You don't have to be a dictator. And if you're fairly gentle about it, then I think people will understand. Sagittarius, it's a weekend where you may not feel entirely comfortable with what's happening. I mean, it's not that it's necessarily a bad weekend, but wherever the energy goes, you might feel that it's not necessarily going your way, and you might feel somewhat separate from it all. And yeah, that's okay. It's nothing to worry about. And perhaps you just have to work out, how best to make use of the weekend. So Sagittarius, I think it's a good idea to ask yourself, what's important? What is it that really matters this weekend? And don't forget, for example, about money and the material dimension. Sagittarius is, in some respects, a very unmaterialistic sign. But Sagittarius does not like to be tied down to something as boring and concrete as money and material possessions. Sagittarius wants to roam free. But, with the moon in Capricorn, making a sextile to Saturn, you may have no choice. It may occur to you that certain things are important, things of a material nature, and there's not really a great deal you can do about it. And so you may have to sort of reluctantly turn your attention to things like money and other material details. And you shouldn't complain about it. And with the moon sextile Saturn, there's actually a possibility, Sagittarius, that you can, in some ways, ground yourself. And where there had been a little bit of instability in the past, you can find a way of getting around it. And it's really perhaps about confronting it. So if there's something you feel that you are lacking in a material sense, then there is a way that you can start to connect with it. And also Capricorn, like yesterday, when I was talking about what was going on for you on Friday, I said something similar. There may be a feeling, Sagittarius, that there's something going on that you don't like the sound of. It feels unpleasant, and you're concerned about it, and it may almost be sort of evil and destructive, as a sort of forces of decay, and you're aware of that, and that might be a distraction, and it might be diminishing your general level of happiness. Now, if you do get those kind of feelings, this is not about you. It's just about how you're feeling about the world. And when we looked at the sort of heliocentric picture, and Mercury is making an opposition to Jupiter, which is your ruler heliocentrically. Jupiter is always your ruler. So we've got a heliocentric T-square with Mercury opposition Jupiter and Mercury square Saturn. Now this heliocentric T-square may go some way towards explaining how uncomfortable you feel. So heliocentrically, we do have a Jupiter-Saturn square. It's a separating square. It's not very exact at the moment, but Mercury is bringing it all together over the weekend. And so Sagittarius, it just may be that you are aware of an underlying social, political, economic reality, and other people can ignore it. They can just live their lives, but I don't think you can. And maybe that's a good thing, that you're just aware of things that just other people can't see, and you can see how things could get bad, and just maybe you're thinking, well, what do you actually need to do to protect yourself? And that's a good question to have. And that goes back to the fact that the moon is making a sextile to Saturn. It's also making a sextile to Venus. You do have a chance to think about what you need to do to make yourself more secure. And I think some of the decisions you make this weekend could be really very good and certainly very sensible. Capricorn. Capricorn, we have the moon in your sign all weekend long, and the moon, while it's moving through Capricorn, is making a sextile to Venus, and it's making a sextile to Saturn. And so as far as I'm concerned, that does mean that, relationships could really function pretty well over the course of the weekend. It is a time when you can get on with people, and most importantly, you can get on with people on your terms. It's not a time when you have to compromise, when you have to do things other people's way. You can be independent, but also sociable, and people, I think, will respect your independence, and they will also, understand that you have got insights that they just haven't got. So, don't be afraid of socializing. Socializing could actually serve you very well, because you just have this quiet power that everyone is just absolutely aware of, and it will be respected. And sure, you benefit from the moon being in Capricorn because, the moon in Capricorn is in an earth sign and it's in your sign. And so, you are grounded. And you're also grounded by the fact that the sun is moving into Taurus. So the sun is in Taurus while the moon is in Capricorn. So sun in Taurus allows you to, very much be yourself and enjoy who you are. I mean, in fact, other people are going to enjoy who you are. So there's absolutely no need to be someone else or try to please other people, because in your natural state, you are great. You are the person everyone wants to have around. So you don't have to make any changes. The sun in Taurus does make a square to Mars in Leo. Now, this Sun-Mars square is a bit difficult, but it affects everyone. It will affect different people in different ways. One way the Sun-Mars square might work is that you could feel a certain amount of guilt or restraint if you are doing something you enjoy. So enjoyment is important, and you can really enjoy yourself this weekend. But Sun square Mars might be about something trying to spoil your enjoyment. Now, that could be your guilt. It could be that you do something that is slightly unplanned, and it's out of character, but you kind of do it anyway. And because you do something that's out of character, everything gets spoiled, and that is so unnecessary. So Capricorn, you have an idea about how the weekend should progress. You know what you like, you know what you enjoy, and you just stick with that. Don't go any further. You don't have to go any further, but if you do go further, if you start moving into strange territory, well, yes, things might go wrong. But as I said, that is completely unnecessary. And if you trust your instincts, I think it can be, a great weekend. 4 stars out of 5, maybe even 5 stars out of 5. Aquarius. Aquarius, probably the main aspect as far as you're concerned, is a square between the Sun and Mars. And this Sun-Mars square does link with Pluto. So you've got Pluto in early Aquarius at the beginning of your sign, and Mars is starting to make an opposition aspect to Pluto, and that opposition aspect will be exact, I think, next week. And then the Sun has gone into Taurus, so the Sun is starting to make a square to Pluto, and this weekend, at the end of the weekend, Sun makes a square to Mars. So we've got this fixed T-square forming, and by the end of the weekend, you may be really starting to feel it, and this could put some Aquarians under pressure. You may just feel that something is building up, and this might be reflected in your various relationships. Other people could be a bit of a problem. I'm not saying they will be a problem, but if you hang out too long with the same person, then the fractures may start to form. And perhaps, with this Sun square Mars, you have to make a real effort to understand other people, why they're behaving in the way they're behaving, and what they might actually want. Because Sun square Mars could represent an angry person, or a person who wants to get their way, and maybe a person who is not particularly respectful of your individuality. So relationships could be a big theme over the weekend, and if you have a choice, maybe one should argue that relationships should be avoided. They could actually spoil the weekend. But instead, you may have to just work with other people and understand, what their problem is or what they're annoyed about, and try to get as much transparency as possible. And Pluto is coming into action, and Pluto has been in Aquarius for some time. Went into Aquarius November of last year, and it's not just something theoretical. It's there. It's saying something about you and how you are changing. And with Pluto in Aquarius, you're starting to realize that your individuality is important. There are certain things you need to hold on to. You don't want to be, overwhelmed by other people's egos and other people wanting to push you around. So, really important, Aquarius, that you do look after yourself. But on a more positive note, the moon is making a sextile to Venus. The moon is also making a sextile to Saturn, and so that does indicate that relationships are not an entirely hopeless cause. That there are people who respect you, who you can relate to, and that moon sextile Venus, sextile Saturn, it does indicate that there are ways of getting on with people in a way that that needn't be destructive. And perhaps what you have to do is just keep things at a level that is just light and easy. And the moment things get intense, the moment people start talking about their way, what they want to do, and what you want to do, well, then when you have those kind of discussions, things could go wrong. But if things are kept at a lower level, I think that the day should be a lot easier. And if you do come under pressure, Aquarius, you should not regard that as being a permanent state of affairs. It has to be like that, and you can change things. And one way you are able to change things is by perhaps not engaging. So if you're in a situation where someone wants you to argue back or to reply to them, and you don't really want to reply to them, maybe the best strategy is to change the subject and to just be happy and be positive and pretend that nothing bad has happened. I mean, I'm not saying anything bad will happen. Just be positive and try to always look at things in a positive way, and even make a show of trying to make light of things. Now, that's not an Aquarian thing. Aquarius is a serious sign, but this weekend, having a bit of levity, even being able to laugh at serious subjects might actually serve you well, and it might act as a distractor. And people who might be trying to get you to do something that you don't want to do, yeah, they might be distracted, and you might sort of find that you somehow dissolve their egos by doing that. So that is the approach. Being happy, smiling, laughing, not taking anything too seriously. Even if deep down you feel that it's very serious, give the impression that everything is light, free, and happy. And in that way, I think that you can have an okay weekend. Pisces. Pisces, we have the moon moving through Capricorn. Moon moving through Capricorn is quite a sociable place for the moon to be from a Piscean viewpoint. You're able to enjoy people's company, especially as the moon is making a sextile to Venus and a sextile to Saturn. Now, that moon sextile Venus, moon sextile Saturn is going to be more about Sunday rather than Saturday. I think that on Saturday, I don't think that a great deal is happening, and it's not until Sunday really that any action starts. And so I think Sunday can be a fairly easygoing and relaxing day, but also a day when you do know how to look after yourself, and you're able to create limits, and you're able to make it clear what the structure of the day is, because moon is sextile Saturn, and Saturn is in your sign. And so perhaps on Sunday, if you're doing anything, you try to be the one who comes up with the ideas, because if you let other people come up with the ideas, then that puts you in a difficult position, especially if you don't agree with these ideas. So try to take the initiative, and to perhaps gently make it clear that there are some things that you're comfortable with, other things that you don't really want to be bothered with. And if you can do that, then things should work out fine. Now, one sign change that we do have over the weekend is the sun moving into Taurus, and with the sun moving into Taurus, it's a time of year when, for Pisceans, communication can be emphasized. There are things that you want to talk about. Why do you want to talk about them? I think the reason you want to talk about them is because you want clarity. And talking about them, finding out what people think is a good way of finding clarity. And it's not just about talking to people, it's about getting hold of information. If you don't understand something, well, you can fill the gaps, and you can bring in new knowledge. You can do some research with Sun in Taurus, and that should work out very well. But the Sun is making a square to Mars, and this might mean that the process of working out what's going on may not be without its own complications. Perhaps you ask too many questions. You ask a question, and the question leads to a suspicion, and you perhaps have to defend yourself. I mean, that's one way in which the Sun-Mars square could work. Also, with the Sun-Mars square, you have to think about short-distance travelling. If possible, on Sunday and Monday, then I would avoid doing any travelling, especially travelling by car. Now, that's not perhaps going to be such a problem if you are in Europe. I mean, Sunday is Easter Sunday. Monday is a bank holiday. Certainly in England, it's bank holiday. But of course, in the United States, Monday is just a normal day. But yeah, I mean, travelling is something to be avoided. Yeah, people like to travel over Easter, but ideally, Pisceans will not travel over Easter. by car. Cars could be a problem. It just might be traffic. It might be mechanical breakdowns. Oh, and additionally, with the Sun square Mars, watch your neighbours. Neighbours, people you meet all the time, but you don't really talk much to, and there's just some danger of a disagreement or an annoyance. It could be that your neighbours are making too much noise. It may be you making too much noise. That's one possibility. Or it just may be that something becomes clear, that you or your neighbour doesn't like what's going on. Maybe you don't like what your neighbour is doing, or your neighbour doesn't like what you're doing. So where there's a neighbour, there's a problem, or there could be a problem. And so perhaps, Pisces, what you need to do is work out what the problem might be, and perhaps try to anticipate the problem. That is one way of working it through. And this Sun square Mars, it's particularly strong late on Sunday and into Monday, but over the coming week, because it's not just Sun square Mars, the Sun in the end, it makes a square to Pluto, Mars makes a square to Pluto, so that might actually be a feature of next week as well. I'm just trying to see the potential for a problem. In most cases, you're not going to have any problems with your neighbours, and it will be fine, but I just thought I had to point that out. And having gone through the 12 signs, I'm going to look at the I Ching for the weekend. So I asked the question, what is the weekend going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first and only hexagram I got was hexagram number 36, which is darkening of the light. And in a way, this is a very appropriate hexagram for the Easter weekend, because it is darkening of the light. You have the light, and it has been wounded, and it has been damaged. It's disappearing. And so, of course, from an Easter perspective, I'm making this recording on a Friday, Good Friday, and so the Easter weekend, Good Friday, Jesus crucified, and on Sunday he's resurrected. So it's a very Easter hexagram, and the fact that it's not moving, suggests that it just simply describes the weekend, and at least from a symbolic view, and it's telling us what the weekend should all be about. And it doesn't really matter whether or not you're a Christian. I think it's a powerful symbolism about death and rebirth. Now this hexagram in Chinese, I don't know any Chinese, but apparently in Chinese it's Ming I. I'm sure I haven't pronounced that right. And one way in which this can be translated is the wounding of the bright, or the light is wounded. So, well, indeed, there's an idea of wounded intelligence, and so light being wounded, crucifixion, but it comes back. And so that's the image of the light. The light is still there, and the symbolism here is, you see, the bottom three lines represent the sun, and the sun is under the earth. That bright light has gone, and so we can look at it in a symbolic way, just reminding us, what Easter is about. We can be more personal about it, and it might say something about our light. It's telling us that, we have got this light, and we would like to show this light, but we're not going to be able to for one reason or another. So events going on over Easter may make it difficult for us to be ourselves. Maybe just other people are going to be making a lot of noise, they're going to be ignoring us, and we just have to accept that, that's the way it is. And part of the symbolism of this might be a court official who is full of light, is very intelligent, is very knowledgeable, but their ruler is ignoring them, and so the light never gets anywhere. And we just have to accept the situation. We can't show our light all the time, and this weekend we just have to be modest and not feel we have to push things. Remember, one aspect we have this weekend is Sun square Mars, and Sun square Mars is really quite a difficult aspect. Sun in Taurus, square Mars in Leo, and this aspect could cause arguments and fights and disputes. And if people have huge egos, Mars in Leo, that could get themselves into trouble. So if we feel that our light is being obscured, it is a bit of an offense to our ego, isn't it? And so we might want to make a fuss. And the advice here is not to make a fuss, to just accept the situation as it runs its course. And this darkening of the light, although it doesn't have any moving lines, it does have a nuclear hexagram. You can always look at the hexagram underlying the hexagram by knocking off the top and bottom lines. And so the nuclear hexagram of darkening of the light is hexagram 40, which is deliverance. And deliverance can be about an escape from something. And so it could be that if we hide our light, we are dodging a difficult situation. Remembering that Sun square Mars, it could be a weekend of conflict. And those who try to show their light could get drawn into the conflict. On the other hand, if we keep a low profile and we don't reveal who we are, even if we feel that other people are getting things wrong, they don't know what they're talking about, we so much want to say something, we so want to intervene, but if we just keep our light to ourselves, we'll be staying out of trouble. And with darkening of the light, there is a feeling sometimes that we're being ignored, but sometimes it's a good thing to be ignored. And by keeping a low profile, we can actually find deliverance. And deliverance just may be about escaping from something that could be very problematic. And so we should be quite relieved then with the way the weekend works out. And now I want to look at the issue of dictators, or wannabe dictators as well. And so yesterday I talked about Mars in Leo, and I wanted to look at a few examples of people with Mars in Leo, and using the very biased selection of charts that I used, there was an indication that Mars in Leo did show up in the charts of certain politicians, particularly politicians who perhaps had aspirations to kingship, who perhaps would quite like to be dictators, are quite jealous of dictators. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are dictators themselves. And so, one chart I looked at was the chart of Emmanuel Macron. Now, whatever you think of Emmanuel Macron, he's not a dictator. He might like to be a dictator. He might like to be Jupiter. He might like to be a king, maybe the Sun King. But he has got Mars in Leo, and I think that Macron, with his arrogance, definitely shows Mars in Leo in action. And someone else who is often described as a dictator is Donald Trump. Now, by the way, I'm not saying he is a dictator. I'm just saying that his opponents think that he is trying to trying to become a dictator. He's trying to upset the constitution, ignore judges, and so on. So that's clearly not the case in my opinion. But he does have Mars in Leo rising, like Emmanuel Macron, and so like Macron, he's perhaps a little bit jealous of people who have a lot of power, and he'd like to have more power. Perhaps he even thinks he should have power, and he's sort of speculated about the possibility of him being able to run for a third term, even though that's, of course, against the Constitution. So, Mars in Leo might give us the idea of people who would, quite like the idea of dictatorship, but maybe can't quite see it through, and it's because of the countries they're born in. If you're in France or the United States, well, you can have aspirations for kingship and dictatorship, but it's not going to work out. And the same might be said for Israel. So Benjamin Netanyahu is often accused of having dictatorial traits. Even before the October the 7th, was it October the 7th, 2023? Before that attack, even before that, I know that a lot of people in Israel were very worried about his behavior and what they saw as attacks on freedom. I mean, when I say people in Israel, I'm talking about Israelis. I'm not talking about Palestinians. And he has Mars in Leo, and so Mars in Leo quite close to Regulus, and so there is that feeling of sort of kingship. He'd quite like to be a king. Of course, Israel has its own connections with kings, in sort of from a biblical point of view, and of course with sort of the sort of Jewish kings in the Bible. In the end, it all went wrong. I mean, I think I'm not a great expert on the Bible, so there's Benjamin Netanyahu. So I wouldn't have said he was a dictator. So you're having aspirations of dictatorship, or Vladimir Zelensky. I wouldn't have said that Vladimir is a dictator. Some of his critics say that he is. He's suspended aspects of the Ukrainian constitution. There should have been an election. He said it's a state of emergency, but Mars in Leo, he has pretensions perhaps to kingship and dictatorship. It's going to be an interesting week for Vladimir Zelensky. Interesting weekend even, because he's got not just Mars return over the weekend, but he's got the Sun square his Mars. So next few days for Vladimir Zelensky are something that we really need to pay attention to. So what I'm suggesting here, because we're talking about dictatorship, and so Mars in Leo may be about people who aspire to have more power than they actually can ever get hold of. There are constraints on them. But then we look at sort of actual dictators. I mean, here's an example of an actual dictator who has who had an actual dictator who had Mars in Leo was Augusto Pinochet. Again, I looked at his chart yesterday, and he has Mars in Leo, and he overthrew the elected government in Chile in 1973, on September the 11th, 1973. Mars in Leo, there is a feeling of entitlement there, but somehow, if you've got Mars in Leo, you think you know best. In his case, he thought he knew best for Chile, and of course, he did have certain dictatorial dictatorial traits, which went a bit further than Trump and Macron and Netanyahu. He actually had people arrested and executed and murdered. I think that was Upton Sinclair who was talking about the definition of fascism, and Upton Sinclair said that the definition of fascism is is capitalism plus murder. And you could say that Augusto Pinochet, using Upton Sinclair's definition, really was a fascist, because he was supported by the United States, the Chicago school sort of monetarist economics, they were big fans of Pinochet, and so he brought in hyper-capitalism into Chile, because the man he opposed, Salvador Allende, was a communist. And so, yeah, he really does illustrate Upton Sinclair's point that capitalism plus murder equals fascism, and him and his regime, they did murder a lot of people. But he wasn't kind of a full dictator in the way that, you know, one thinks of like Stalin or Hitler or even Franco. So if we move to the next level, you could have Franco. So Francisco Franco was the sort of generalissimo in Spain. He defeated the Republicans in the late 1930s and became effective dictator of Spain. And, you know, like Allende, he had the sun in Sagittarius, and I do think that there is a connection between sun in Sagittarius and being a dictator. And the connection is, I'm not, by the way, if you're a Sagittarius, I'm not saying you're a dictator, but given you are a dictator and you have the sun in Sagittarius, well, you might want to know, you know, why that is the case. And the sun in Sagittarius, it's in a sign ruled by Jupiter. And Jupiter is a sign that is moralistic. It can be moralistic. One often forgets that. You have a sense about what is right, what is wrong. And it can actually be very conservative in a sort of a traditional Catholic sense. So Augusto Pinochet had the sun in Sagittarius, and yeah, he was very moralistic. He had clear ideas about the way things should be, and perhaps he was representative of a traditional Catholic way of viewing things. And with Francisco Franco, even more so. You know, he represented, he did represent Catholicism. He was not a dictator like Hitler. He wasn't trying to overthrow everything and create some kind of year zero. No, far from it. He wanted to keep things traditional, keep things the way they were, and that might be his sun in Sagittarius. And Francisco Franco, he had the moon in Gemini, and so there's a sort of an opposition here between the sun in Sagittarius, moon in Gemini, and so the moon in Gemini. I don't know a lot about Francisco Franco. I mean, I don't think he was known for making big speeches, but another dictator who was known for making his speeches was Benito Mussolini. Now, Benito Mussolini is who had the moon in Gemini. Clearly demonstrated that aspect of the dictator who just talks, you know, on the balcony and talks and talks and talks, and his moon was conjunct Mars, conjunct Saturn. So this is a dictator who has he has got his sun in Leo. He doesn't have Mars in Leo. He has the sun in Leo, and so you could if you look at Benito Mussolini, he is just classic Leo. And if you want to have a stereotype of Leo, then Benito Mussolini would fit that very well. And there is something rather comic about it. And so his moon was on the Mars Saturn midpoint. So that's quite a nasty moon to have, and the moon can represent the people, and probably moon on the Mars Saturn as the death axis, of course, using whole sign houses. That's in the 8th house. Even Placidus, it's pretty close to the 8th house, and that may say something about his end. the fact that he was strung up by his heels in 1945. So that's Moon on the Mars Saturn midpoint, and also with Benito Mussolini, his horoscope is all the planets are above the horizon, everything. So if you've got a chart like that above the horizon, there may be a certain lack of groundedness. Does he really know what he's doing? And also, Benito Mussolini has no personal planets in Earth signs, and so the question is, did he have any idea what he was doing? He had all these military pretensions. When Italy invaded Greece, it was supposed to be easy. It was supposed to be a slam dunk, wasn't it? Or whatever a slam dunk means. People say it's supposed to be easy. But he was defeated by the Greeks, and then the Germans had to come in to help. And whenever the Italians got involved in something militarily on their own, they couldn't see it through. They had a big navy. I think Italy at one stage had the second largest navy in the world, or the largest air force in the world. So they had all this stuff at the height of Mussolini's pre-war power, and on paper it had a massive military, but in practice it was nothing. It just didn't work, and that might say something about Mussolini and his just complete lack of earth, that there was no groundedness to it. And so you can see that him as a dictator, you can see why he failed, why it just didn't work out. I mean, of course, if you were an Italian, it wasn't very, and you tried to resist him, it wasn't very nice. He could be a real dictator in terms of his own country and making people's lives miserable, and arresting people, executing them, and so forth. But as far as a dictator who's projecting the power of his nation on a global stage, he was a failure. And before I look at Hitler, there is, we talked about Sagittarius and dictators, and so Stalin for sure was a dictator, and Stalin had his sun in Sagittarius, and Stalin, I've set this chart for noon, and Stalin's chart is always a bit of a problem. Well, it's a problem for me, and it could have been an embarrassment, but no one noticed. I wrote this book in 1994. It came out at the end of 1994, and Life, Love and Destiny. I don't know. It was this book where I just tried to do a teach yourself astrology book. I co-wrote it, and I went through examples of all people with different signs, and I went through Stalin's chart. Well, I didn't go into detail about Stalin. I just mentioned the fact that he was a Capricorn, and in 1994, according to existing knowledge, Stalin was a Capricorn. If you looked up Stalin's date of birth anywhere, always said he was a Capricorn, and it completely fitted my view of a Capricorn. And then later it became apparent that he wasn't a Capricorn. Someone did some research in some church in Georgia, and they found that actually he was born on December the 18th, 1878, but in fact he was a Sagittarius. So I was gutted by that realization that he wasn't a Capricorn, but he was a Sagittarius, and a Sagittarius is a mutable sign, and I wouldn't have said that he was conservative in the way that Franco and Pinochet were, although he had a religious background. He was training to be a priest, so that might be Sun in Sagittarius, and he has a certain amount of mutability in his chart. In fact, if you look at Stalin's chart, he only has one planet in a fixed sign, and that's just Mars in Scorpio, and that's interesting. So we're dealing with a dictator who has a certain amount of flexibility, and that's an important contrast when we look at Hitler's chart. And I think that suggests why, in some respects, Stalin in the end was more successful than Hitler. So with Hitler, you have someone who had their sun in a fixed sign. Now, you might say that if you want to be a successful dictator, then you might need to have a certain fixity. You know, when one thinks of Hitler, you think of, you know, the triumph of the will. Wasn't that the triumph of the will? That propaganda film made by Leni Riefenstahl in the 1930s. You know, so Hitler, with his sun in Taurus, absolutely fixed. You know, he has got Sun in Taurus, Mars in Taurus, Venus in Taurus. He's got Saturn in Leo. So he's certainly got four traditional planets in fixed signs. But that fixity may just be so important if you want to really make things happen. He just didn't consider any other possibilities, and that explained his successes, and it also explained his failure. So if someone is very certain of themselves, then yeah, sure, they can make things happen. You know, and that was reflected not just in the way he came to power, being completely single-minded, but also in the way he conducted the war. So he had these crazy ideas about taking over Europe. He was completely fixed about it, and other people, his generals, thought he was crazy, but he just went ahead with it anyway. And at the beginning of the war, he was incredibly successful. He took over, you know, the whole of Europe pretty much. And, you know, with Hitler, you have Libra rising, and the Libra rising is kind of interesting because apparently in the 1930s there were astrologers in the West in Britain who said that basically there was going to be no war, and the logic for that was because he had Libra rising. Because he had Libra rising, he was a man of peace. That was how it went. And I can't give you a precise quotation, but I can assure you that is right, that there were astrologers thinking that way. And this reminds us that Libra rising, it's a mask. That is a sort of a modern psychological way of looking at the ascendant compared with the sun. And I would kind of agree with that. I don't think that the ascendant is the real person. You know, that's why when I look at elemental balances, I don't look at the element of the element of the ascendant. It is the vehicle, but it's not the real person. So with Libra rising, he could appear to be very accommodating. He was very charismatic. I mean, there are other reasons why he was charismatic. He had a conjunction between Venus and Mars, which definitely gives charisma. And also with Hitler, I think a major factor in his success was his Saturn in Leo, because Saturn in Leo, it seems on the surface to be a problem because Saturn is in its detriment in Leo, because Saturn rules Aquarius. So you would have thought that's quite a weak Saturn. But if you look at Saturn in a different way, if you take the concept of sect, S-E-C-T, you know, where its sects are. So Saturn is a daytime planet, and therefore Saturn likes a daytime chart, and Hitler was born by day. And because it's a daytime planet, it likes to be above the horizon, and Saturn is indeed above the horizon. And finally, Saturn is a masculine planet, and it's in a masculine sign. So although it's in its detriment, it's very strong through its placement. You know, the fact that it is daytime chart above the horizon in a masculine sign. So, and it's pretty close to the midheaven. So that does give him the possibility of leadership, rulership. Another example of a chart with Saturn in Leo like that is a chart of Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton has Saturn in Leo above the horizon, and so it's a fixity that made Hitler, but it's also the fixity that perhaps destroyed him. So if you'd make the comparison during the Second World War between Hitler and Stalin, so Stalin, was had his sun in Sagittarius, and so perhaps Stalin had greater flexibility. He had the Sun and Venus in Sagittarius, and of course, when things went wrong during the Second World War, Stalin behaved in a way that was different from Hitler. So when things went wrong for Hitler in the war, and his generals just told him he needed to change his strategy, him with his planets in fixed signs would completely refuse to budge. He refused to allow von Paulus to surrender, to retreat from Stalingrad. They just had to absolutely hold their ground, and that contrasts with Stalin, who, when things were completely going wrong for Stalin, and Stalin's generals told him he had to change his strategy, which would be an incredibly dangerous thing to do. I mean, generals were shot in great number during the 1930s, but still, his generals went to Stalin and told him he was getting it wrong. And Stalin, not having all those fixed planets, actually having only one fixed planet, Mars in Scorpio, Stalin said, "Okay, we'll try it your way." So that is a big difference between Hitler and Stalin. Hitler's fixity, it made him as a dictator. So if we're talking about the horoscopes of dictators, if you want to be a kind of a super dictator, then maybe you need this fixity like Adolf Hitler. But that fixity will, in the end, destroy you. And so this leads us finally to the contrast between him and Charlie Chaplin. And of course, this weekend we've got the sun moving into Taurus, and with Charlie Chaplin's horoscope, Charlie Chaplin was born on April the 16th, 1889, whereas Hitler was born on April the 20th, 1889. Charlie Chaplin was an Aries, and Hitler was a Taurus. Some people say at first, when they don't really know a great deal about astrology, they say, "Oh no, Hitler's an Aries." They say, "Oh yeah, he's an Aries. He's an Aries." Of course, you have to tell them, "Well, he's not an Aries." On April 20th, sometimes the sun is in Aries, sometimes it's in Taurus on April 20th. It depends. But there is a sort of a crude view of Aries to think that Hitler, that sounds like an Aries, so he's into wars, attacking things. That sounds like a typically Aries thing, but of course it's not. That's not what Aries is about. Aries, as a sign, doesn't have the kind of grudges that Hitler had. Hitler was all based on grudges and resentment, and you can think about the psychology of Hitler. Aries isn't like that. Aries moves on. I mean, that is one of the great things about Aries. And so, an Aries maybe couldn't be a dictator because Aries wouldn't really be bothered about it. But Hitler was, motivated by his past and how he felt he was treated. And again, that's all those Taurus planets just holding on to things. So with Charlie Chaplin, he's an Aries. He wasn't going to be a dictator. That was just not going to be who he was, a completely different person. I mean, he still has Venus-Mars conjunction, like Hitler does, but he's using his Venus-Mars conjunction in a different way. Clearly, he was a charismatic actor. I mean, that may say something about his private life. Of course, there was a lot of questions about his private life, and that sort of undermined his reputation at some level. I don't know whether that was true or not. Of course, Charlie Chaplin was. There were attempts to discredit Charlie Chaplin because he was seen to be potentially a communist, I think, in the end, and that's why Chaplin never actually became an American citizen. In the end, he went back to Europe. But so there is that difference, but there's also that weird connection, isn't it? Because when you look at that picture of Charlie Chaplin in The Great Dictator, of course, that's what he did. I mean, his film, The Great Dictator, which he did in 1940, where he took on the role of Adenoid Hinkle, who was a parody of Hitler, and in that film there was also someone who was parodying Mussolini. I think someone called Benzino Nepolani was another character in that film who was supposed to be Mussolini. So there is that, so there's that weird link between Charlie Chaplin and Adolf Hitler, born 4 days apart, completely different careers. Both, of course, became super famous, and Charlie Chaplin actually went and played Hitler in that film, The Great Dictator. So those are a few thoughts about dictators. So dictators come in many shapes and sizes, and there are, with Mars in Leo, you have people who might like to be a dictator, who might like to at least be kings, but to actually become a real dictator, maybe you need to have some sort of complication to you. I mean, there needs to be some sense in which you have a complicated past. Actually, because I forgot about Napoleon. Of course, Napoleon was a Leo, and Napoleon was a Leo like Mussolini, so we shouldn't forget about Napoleon. But still, we do think about Hitler as being this man who dominated the 20th century, the 20th century, or mid 20th century. But maybe he was unique. Maybe if we're looking at the traits of a dictator, maybe Hitler is not a good example. Maybe we should be looking at other things. Maybe the fire, certainly, the sun in Leo with Mussolini and Napoleon. That's certainly the aspiration to dictatorship. So we can't make any absolute judgments about what is a dictator, but I thought it was just interesting to look at a few charts of people who either were dictators or wanted to be dictators. So sorry to have rambled on a bit, and thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there is a link in the description. And have a happy Easter, and I will talk to you again very soon.